They say the forest watches in silence. But what if something watches you back? On a snow-covered morning in the heart of Colorado, a woman alone in the woods begins to feel the weight of unseen eyes, tracking her every move. Not a hunter, not a person, but something wild. And when she reaches out her hand, everything changes. This isn't just a story about survival, or even courage. It's about a connection so deep, so instinctive, it defies logic. Stay with us because what begins as a quiet observation soon unravels into one of the most soul-stirring bonds ever witnessed in the wild. The silence that watches. The snow had fallen in layers overnight, blanketing the entire forest outside Gunnison, Colorado, in pristine white. Each breath that left Elena Marlowe's lips turned to fog, dissolving quickly into the still morning air. At 42, Elena was no stranger to solitude. But this felt different. Bundled in a thick navy parka, thermals underneath and her trusty Nikon hanging from her neck, she stepped out of the creaky wooden cabin she'd rented for the winter. The cabin stood nestled on the edge of Gunnison National Forest, miles away from the nearest neighbor or road. Just as she liked it. Elena had come here not for photography, but for healing. A year had passed since she'd lost her younger sister Claire in a mountain hiking accident. Grief hadn't knocked her over with a single blow. It had gnawed at her slowly. She'd stopped working, stopped seeing friends, but not stopped feeling. She hoped the snow would numb her, in a way nothing else had. As her boots crunched softly through the thin top layer of frost, she adjusted the lens cap and glanced toward the tree line. Still, so still. It was only 7:12 a.m., the kind of morning where even the birds seemed to have hit snooze. But as she raised her camera toward a patch of frost-tipped pine, she felt it. That pull, that unmistakable tingle that tells you are not alone. She lowered the camera slowly. Her heart ticked up a beat. Her eyes scanned the tree line. At first, she saw nothing, just snow clinging to branches, sunlight catching ice in the air like glitter. But there, 40 feet out, half shrouded in shadow between two narrow aspens, a shape, low to the ground, unmoving. The air suddenly felt sharper, as if the cold had crept deeper into her lungs. She squinted, focusing past the falling snow. Amber eyes, locking onto her from the underbrush. Not a coyote, too broad in the chest. Not a mountain lion. The ears were rounded, the tail short, barely a stump. Elena froze. It was a bobcat, a wild one. A North American bobcat, by the look of it. Maybe 6 years old, fully grown, with a dappled, reddish-gray coat that blended almost too perfectly with the snowy earth around it. They weren't supposed to be this close to humans, were they? Yet it sat there, eyes unblinking, not crouched in threat, not running, just watching. And Elena, frozen not by fear, but by something else. Recognition. She didn't raise her camera. She didn't move. She simply whispered, "You're beautiful," into the cold air. The bobcat didn't blink. A gust of wind lifted the snow off a nearby branch, a tiny flurry dancing between them. Then the moment passed. Elena exhaled. The cat was gone. Just like that. But something had started. Something neither of them understood just yet. And by the next morning, those amber eyes would return. Again. Elena didn't sleep that night. Not fully. She sat near the small wood stove, fire crackling, her journal open on her lap, but untouched. Her thoughts replayed that morning's moment in a loop. The bobcat, its eyes. It wasn't just seeing her, it was reading her, interpreting something beyond words. She knew it sounded absurd, but out here, where everything slowed down, absurdities felt more like truths. By dawn, the light had shifted to pale gold. Elena pulled on her boots and stepped outside, careful not to crunch the snow too loudly. Her breath quickened as she scanned the same tree line. Nothing. She poured warm water into a tin bowl, left it by the porch, along with a strip of smoked salmon from last night's dinner. It wasn't bait. It was a gesture. Then she sat on the steps, wrapping her gloved hands around a thermos of black coffee, and waited. An hour passed, then another. Only wind, whispering through pine. She gave up by noon, shoulders stiff, fingertips aching. But when she stepped out again at sunset, the bowl was empty. Tracks in the snow, a series of wide padded paw prints leading toward the trees. Then gone. The bobcat had come and gone again, quietly, without a sound. Over the next few days, a rhythm began. Mornings were still, evenings watched. Sometimes she would catch those amber eyes between the branches at twilight. Just staring, unblinking, measuring, and she stopped being afraid. On the fourth day, Elena dared to sit farther from the cabin, at the edge of the woods, wrapped in blankets and stillness. She placed the food nearby and whispered softly, not to the trees, not even to herself, but to the presence. The bobcat didn't approach, but she saw the silhouette between the trees, closer than before. It wasn't hiding anymore. It was listening. Elena began calling it Mira, Latin for wonder. She didn't know why. It just felt right. Mira's coat gleamed under the winter moonlight, speckled with snow, ears twitching at the faintest sound, short tail flicking side to side, muscles coiled in slow, deliberate movement. A predator, yes, but something more. She wasn't circling prey. She was circling possibility. Elena felt it deep in her chest. This wasn't a territorial warning. It was curiosity. Something ancient in both of them had stirred. And the forest, once so cold and unforgiving, now felt warmer in her presence. A trust was forming. Not complete, not spoken, but real. And one evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon and the air turned blue with twilight, Mira took a step forward into the clearing. Not to eat, not to stalk, but just to see. They stood 15 feet apart. No camera between them, no barrier, just two souls tethered by silence, sharing the same breath in the snowy stillness. And in that frozen moment, Elena realized this was not just observation. It was the beginning of something neither of them could explain, but both of them needed. Footsteps in the quiet. Trust doesn't shout. It waits, quiet and still, for someone to notice. The eighth morning dawned under a heavy gray sky. Snow drifted lazily, and the air hung thick with the hush that follows fresh powder. Elena had made it a ritual now. Coffee before sunrise, a small offering of food on the stump near the edge of the woods, and then silence. Waiting. Not for a photo. Not anymore. For something else. Mira had returned every day for nearly a week now. Always at a distance, always silent. But this time, something shifted. Elena was seated cross-legged near the stump, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, her gloved hands cradling a journal she hadn't written in for days. She looked up, and Mira was already there, 10 feet away, closer than ever. The bobcat's breath came in slow puffs, visible against the icy air. She didn't move, didn't blink. Neither did Elena. She swallowed, her heart thudding like a drum in her chest. Her instinct told her not to reach out, not yet. This moment was like a snowflake resting on a pine needle, delicate, fleeting, perfect. They stared at each other, for what felt like hours, but could only have been seconds. Mira lowered her body to a seated position, muscles still taut but not tense. Her ears flicked, nose twitching, as if cataloging Elena's scent again, storing it deeper this time. Not threat, not prey, just presence. Elena whispered, "You came early today." The bobcat didn't flinch at her voice. That alone felt like progress. She continued softly, telling Mira about her sister, about how they used to come to places like this when they were kids, watching deer from behind rocks, trying to track rabbits in the snow. She didn't expect Mira to understand. But Mira stayed. That was enough. Then the wind shifted. Mira's nose caught something. She stood, took 3 measured steps toward the stump. Her paws barely made a sound. She sniffed the food. Today it was a few bites of roast chicken Elena had cooked the night before. Then, delicately, she took it. Not greedily, as if accepting a gift. Then, another step forward. Elena's breath caught. They were less than 6 feet apart now. She didn't move, didn't even blink. The snow around them shimmered in silence. And then, just as suddenly, Mira turned and vanished into the trees. No noise, no farewell. But she had come closer than ever before. She had taken what was offered, not just the food, but the gesture. It was their first real interaction. Not a test of patience anymore, but an invitation. And deep in Elena's chest, something unthawed. Not fully, but enough. Enough to whisper into the cold, "See you tomorrow." And she knew now, with a strange certainty, Mira would be back. The next morning was colder. A brutal wind swept down from the ridges, stinging Elena's cheeks and reddening her nose within minutes of stepping outside. But she didn't go back in. She couldn't. Not after yesterday. She needed to know if it had been real. If Mira would return. She brought a folding stool today, a thick blanket wrapped tight around her legs, and 2 pieces of cooked trout, lightly salted, laid gently on the stump. She waited in silence, not scanning the woods, not checking her camera, just listening to the trees breathe. And after nearly an hour, without a sound, Mira appeared. Same as always. Amber eyes glowing like twin coals against the white. But today she was limping. Elena noticed it immediately, a subtle favoring of the left forepaw, barely perceptible unless you were watching closely. Mira stepped cautiously toward the stump, ate quickly, and lingered. She didn't turn away. She didn't leave. Elena's voice trembled slightly in the cold. "You're hurt, aren't you?" The bobcat flicked an ear but didn't move. And in a moment that felt pulled from a dream, Elena did something reckless. Something tender. She slowly removed her glove, extended her bare hand toward the snow-covered earth between them. She didn't reach for Mira. She simply placed her palm down, fingers slightly curled, steady as stone. The air between them hung thick with possibility. Mira's body was still, eyes locked on Elena's hand. 5 feet apart now. 4. Elena didn't breathe. Mira took 1 step, then another. Elena could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. The bobcat stopped just 2 feet away. Her nose twitched. Her body tensed, then relaxed. And then it happened. Mira leaned forward and touched her nose, just barely, to Elena's fingers. It was like being struck by lightning wrapped in snow. Warm breath against her skin. Coarse whiskers brushing her knuckles. It lasted less than 2 seconds. But it rewrote everything. Elena didn't cry, though her eyes brimmed. Instead, she whispered the only thing that made sense. "Thank you." Mira backed away, not out of fear, but like someone retreating with dignity. She turned toward the woods but paused once, glancing back, then disappeared into the thicket. Elena sat motionless, her hand still in the snow, fingers tingling with cold, and something else she couldn't name. This wasn't about taming a wild animal. This wasn't about control. It was about respect, recognition, 2 broken things choosing for a moment not to hide from each other. When she finally stood, brushing the snow off her knees, Elena looked up at the trees, and for the first time in a long time, whispered a prayer. Not for protection, not for answers, just gratitude, for being seen. You don't always have to speak to be understood. Sometimes you just have to be seen. Where grief meets the wild. That night, Elena stayed up late, scribbling furiously in her journal by candlelight. She couldn't shake the feeling of Mira's breath on her skin, the ghost of that contact still alive in her palm. It had been days since she'd touched another living soul, and years since she'd felt anything like that touch meant something. She stared at the words she'd written so far, None of them captured it. So she stopped writing and just stared at the flame, letting her mind wander to a face she hadn't let herself remember in weeks. Claire, her baby sister, soft-spoken, fierce in quiet ways. The one who could get a wounded hawk to sit in her lap by simply sitting still long enough. They used to hike through these mountains together every winter break when they were younger. Claire had called it their season of stillness. Elena had always brought the camera. Claire had always brought bandages, for the animals they never expected to find, but always, somehow did. Elena remembered one trip, the winter of 2005. They found a fox snared in wire near the creek. Elena panicked. Claire didn't. She just looked at the fox and whispered, "It's okay. I see you." Those 3 words had stayed with Elena ever since. She whispered them now, alone in her cabin. "It's okay. I see you." But this time it wasn't for a fox. It wasn't even for Mira. It was for herself. The next day, she brought nothing to the stump. No food, no camera, just herself. Wrapped in her thickest coat, scarf knotted tight, she sat in the snow at the edge of the clearing, staring at the tree line. And as if summoned, not by hunger, but by habit, Mira appeared. The limp was still there but lighter. Elena exhaled with relief. The bobcat moved cautiously, slower today. Less wary. They stared at each other, not in a test of dominance or fear, but like 2 women who had lost something they couldn't name. Something they didn't need to explain. And then Elena did something she hadn't done in over a year. She spoke Claire's name aloud. To the trees, to the snow, to Mira. "My sister died here," she said softly, her breath fogging the air. "Not in this forest, but on a trail like this. Cold. Slipped off a ledge before I could grab her. I think that's why I came here. Not to forget, but to find something she left behind." Mira sat on her haunches, ears perked. Still, listening. Maybe not understanding the words, but feeling them. Sensing the tremor in Elena's voice, the ache beneath it. That's when Elena knew this wasn't just a fascination with a wild animal. This was something deeper. Mira wasn't healing because of Elena. She was healing with her. Together. 2 souls, separated by species, joined by something more primal than language. Shared pain. And the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, they could still feel whole again. When wildness leans in, the following morning arrived clear and painfully cold. The temperature had plunged overnight to near 0, and the snow crunched beneath Elena's boots like glass. She had almost turned back, almost. But something told her today would be different. She wore an extra layer under her parka and packed only a small flask of warm broth and a pouch of dried venison. It wasn't just about feeding Mira anymore. It was about showing up, again and again, with consistency, with softness, with presence. The clearing looked untouched when she arrived. No paw prints, no signs of movement, just snow and silence. Elena sat cross-legged on her usual patch of flattened snow, laying the pouch gently at her side. She poured some broth into a tin lid, steam rising like a breath into the cold air. Then she waited. 10 minutes, 20. She began to wonder if Mira had finally moved on. Or worse, if the injury had taken a toll deeper than she'd realized. Then, a rustle, the faintest break in the wind, and there she was. Mira emerged from the brush slowly, like she had to push her way through something unseen, something heavier than snow. She looked thinner today, exhausted. Her gait was labored, her breath visible in thick bursts. Elena's heart twisted. She didn't move, didn't speak, only watched. Mira approached without hesitation now, no longer circling wide. She walked straight toward Elena and sat less than 3 feet away. Elena reached into the pouch and placed a thin strip of venison on her open palm, then held it out in the space between them. Her hand trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the moment. Mira blinked slowly, then leaned in, and for the second time in less than a week, she made contact. This time, not with hesitation, with intention. Her whiskers brushed Elena's palm as she took the food gently between her teeth. No lunge, no snap, just care. Elena could feel the texture of Mira's breath on her skin. Warm, raw, real. Time paused. The woods fell away. And it was just them, a woman wrapped in grief and snow, and a wild creature once broken by pain, now choosing closeness. Then, with surprising boldness, Mira didn't back away. She lay down, right there. Front legs curled beneath her chest, eyes half-lidded. Her body relaxed completely, exposed, vulnerable. Elena's throat tightened. This wasn't just acceptance. This was surrender. The kind no human could ever force or fake. She reached out slowly, her fingertips brushing Mira's thick fur along her shoulder. It was wiry and matted near the joint, warm beneath the surface, and Mira didn't flinch. Elena whispered, "You're safe here." And in that instant, something shifted, not just in Mira, but in Elena herself. For the first time since Claire's death, she felt her own walls lower, not fall, just soften. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was sacred. Because sometimes the most powerful healing doesn't come from being fixed. It comes from being trusted. It only takes one missing shadow in the snow to realize how deeply you've grown attached. When the silence breaks. The storm came suddenly. No warning, no subtle buildup. Just a hard, howling wind that barreled down the mountain and swallowed the forest in white. By dawn, Elena's cabin windows were rimmed in thick frost. The trees bent under the weight of heavy snow, and visibility dropped to near zero. She wrapped herself in layers, pressed her forehead against the window, and waited for a flicker of movement near the tree line. But there was none, not at noon, not by sunset. Mira didn't come. For the first time in 2 weeks, the clearing remained untouched. Elena didn't panic at first. Bobcats were solitary by nature, wild, self-reliant. Maybe the storm had forced her to shelter deeper into the woods. Maybe she was just waiting it out. Still, the unease crept in. She checked the weather report, sub-zero temperatures for the next 2 nights, wind chills approaching -20 degrees Fahrenheit. And Mira had been limping again. The memory of her lying beside Elena, ribs just beginning to fill out, eyes heavy with exhaustion. Elena couldn't get it out of her head. Something was wrong. By morning of the second day, the anxiety was unbearable. Elena couldn't stay inside. She packed a thermal backpack with water, bandages, bits of cooked meat, and a flashlight. Then she stepped into the blizzard. The cold was vicious. Snow slapped her face, cut her cheeks, soaked through her gloves within minutes. She kept to the edge of the familiar trail, eyes squinting through the swirling white. "Mira," she called softly, afraid of her own voice getting lost in the wind. Then she saw it, barely visible in the powder. Tracks. Paw prints. Fresh, but erratic. She knelt down, traced the indentations with shaking fingers. They zigzagged instead of following a straight line. Something was off. Elena followed them into a cluster of pine, her breath shallow from both cold and fear. Branches whipped her face. The snow grew deeper, past her knees now, and then blood. A smear on the snow, small, but distinct. She crouched lower, heart hammering. Another smear 10 feet ahead. And there, curled at the base of a felled tree, half covered in snow, barely visible in the blue light of late afternoon. Mira, still. Too still. Elena cried out and stumbled forward, nearly dropping her bag. She sank to her knees beside the bobcat, brushing snow from her fur. Mira's body was limp, her sides barely rising with each breath. A gash ran across her back leg, red against the pale fur. Her ears flicked at the sound of Elena's voice. but only slightly. "Mira, hey, stay with me." Her hands worked fast, instinctively. Blanket first, then pressure on the wound, then warmth. Her own body heat as she wrapped herself around the shivering animal. They stayed like that in the snow, Elena whispering into Mira's ear, her own tears freezing on her cheeks. "You're not dying out here," she murmured. "Not alone." The wind roared, but neither of them moved. Because when you find something wild and beautiful that trusts you, you don't let it go into the dark alone, carrying what cannot be left behind. Elena had never carried anything so precious, or so fragile, through terrain so unforgiving. Mira's body was heavier than she expected, muscle and fur soaked through with snow, limp with exhaustion. But Elena didn't hesitate. She bundled the Bobcat in her emergency blanket, secured her against her chest, and pushed back toward the cabin, every step a battle. The storm hadn't let up. Snow whipped sideways, stinging her eyes. Visibility was down to 20 feet. She lost the trail twice and had to backtrack by memory alone, using fallen logs and familiar tree formations to orient herself. Every few minutes she'd stop to check Mira's breathing. Still shallow, still there. "Hang on, girl," she whispered through chattering teeth. "You've made it this far. We're not quitting now." Her legs burned from trudging through thigh-deep snow, and more than once she nearly collapsed. But each time she faltered, the weight of Mira against her reminded her what was at stake. She wasn't just carrying an animal. She was carrying a story unfinished, a bond that hadn't reached its final page. It took over an hour to cover the quarter-mile back to the cabin. By the time Elena stumbled up the porch steps, her arms were numb and her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. Inside, warmth blasted from the wood stove, and the sudden contrast made her dizzy. She kicked the door shut behind her and laid Mira gently on a blanket near the fire. Her hands moved with a calm that didn't match the panic in her chest. She sterilized a knife, trimmed the fur around the wound, cleaned it with saline and antiseptic. It wasn't deep enough to be fatal, but the cold had been. The real enemy was hypothermia. Elena wrapped Mira in layers of towels, draped a hot water bottle across her flank, and began speaking softly, rambling almost, telling stories of Claire and snowy hikes and nights spent under stars they couldn't name. She needed Mira to hear her, to stay. An hour passed, then two. Mira didn't move. Elena didn't sleep. She sat beside her, sipping lukewarm tea, keeping vigil like a sister might. At some point in the early hours of morning, Mira's ear twitched, then her paw. Her breathing deepened. Elena leaned forward, breath caught in her throat. Mira's eyes opened, slowly, heavily. They met Elena's. No wild panic and no fear. Just a quiet, exhausted recognition. "You're back," Elena whispered, her voice cracking. Mira blinked once, and in that small, simple movement, Elena felt a warmth rise in her chest that no fire could match. The storm raged outside, but inside that tiny cabin, something stronger than the cold had taken hold. It wasn't survival. It was devotion. And as Mira drifted back into sleep, safe and warm, Elena knew she hadn't just saved a life. She had protected something rare. A connection built not through taming, but through trust, earned, tested, and held, even through the teeth of a blizzard. To love something wild is to know one day it will walk away, whole, healed, and free. Some goodbyes are silent. The days that followed were slow and quiet. The storm passed, but its memory lingered in the heavy snowdrifts and the way the trees leaned under their burden. Inside the cabin, warmth returned. And so did Mira, not all at once. At first, she only stirred to drink warm broth or nibble at strips of venison. Elena laid beside her. She would sleep for hours, deep, dreamless rest, the kind that spoke of survival, finally giving way to healing. Elena hardly left her side. She read aloud from old journals, told stories of Claire, and sometimes just sat in silence, listening to the crackling of the wood stove as the wind whispered against the cabin walls. On the third day, Mira stood, wobbly at first, but standing. By the fifth, she walked the length of the cabin with slow, steady grace. No panic, no wildness, just trust. Elena kept the front door closed, but she knew that wouldn't last. Not forever. Mira's gaze had started drifting toward the window, toward the pale blue of the sky and the white expanse of the world outside. By the seventh day, Mira stood beside the door, looking back at Elena, then forward again. Elena's heart sank and soared all at once. She knew this moment was coming. She had never tried to keep Mira. That was never what this was. It was always a gift borrowed from the wild. She knelt beside her, brushing a hand along Mira's thick fur, softer now, healthier, full of life again. "You're ready," Elena whispered. Mira didn't blink, didn't flinch, only waited. Elena stood slowly, pulled on her parka, and opened the cabin door. The cold swept in, sharp and bright. Mira stepped outside. The snow had hardened overnight into a crust of glittering white. She moved with care, her weight now stronger, surer, each paw placed with the quiet certainty of something that belonged to the land. Elena followed her to the edge of the clearing. Mira paused, sniffing the air. Then she turned. Not fully, just enough to glance back once. A flicker of amber eyes. And then without a sound she disappeared into the trees. No drama, no farewell, just a return. Elena stood there, long after the bobcat had vanished. She didn't cry. Not this time. Because this wasn't loss. It was fulfillment. She hadn't rescued a wild thing. She had witnessed its healing. And in that process, found a part of her own grief softened, reshaped into something gentler. She turned back toward the cabin, boots crunching softly over the frozen earth. Inside, the fire still burned. The blanket Mira had slept on lay undisturbed near the hearth. Elena didn't pack it away. She let it stay exactly where it was. Because some goodbyes don't need to be final. Sometimes the wild returns. But even if it doesn't, the imprint it leaves is enough to change everything. Where the wild leaves its mark. Spring came slowly to the Colorado highlands. The snow melted in reluctant patches, revealing frost-bitten earth and shoots of green that dared to push through the thaw. The forest came alive again, first in sound, then in color. And Elena changed with it. She stayed in the cabin long after her initial rental period ended. What began as an escape had become a pilgrimage, one she wasn't ready to leave behind. She ventured farther now, walking deeper into the woods with her camera, not to chase images, but to honor them. Not everything needed to be photographed. Not everything needed proof. Some things, like Mira, were felt, not framed. Still, Elena couldn't help but scan the tree line every time she stepped into the clearing. For weeks, it remained empty, and she accepted that. Because wild things, once healed, returned to the rhythm that called them. They do not linger in doorways. They do not ask for closure. But one morning, in that thin hour between night and light, Elena saw something that made her stop mid-step. Just at the ridge, framed between two sunlit pines, stood a familiar silhouette. Broad chest, tufted ears, short tail flicking lazily in the morning breeze. Mira. She looked different now. Stronger, thicker in the shoulders, her coat shining with health and sun. She stood still, watching Elena, just like that very first time. But this time there was no tension, no waiting, just presence. Elena didn't move, didn't speak. She only smiled. Mira didn't come closer. She didn't need to. This wasn't a return. It was a moment, a final glance, a shared acknowledgement of what they had been to each other. Then Mira turned, and like the snow before her, she melted into the trees without a sound. Elena stood there a long while after. She didn't follow. She didn't cry. Instead, she looked down at her camera, then back up at the spot where Mira had stood, and she whispered, "Thank you." Months later, Elena returned to the city. But something had shifted in her. She started photographing again. People, animals, places. But always with an eye for what couldn't be staged. What couldn't be posed. Only felt. She published a photo series called The Winter Gaze. It contained no images of Mira, but one photo became the signature piece. A wide-angle shot of the snowy clearing, early morning light, a trail of paw prints leading into the woods. The caption read, "Some souls never leave us. They just return to where they were always meant to be." And every time someone asked her what the photo meant, Elena simply smiled and said, "It's about trust, real trust, the kind that only happens once in a lifetime." And those who looked closely swore they could feel it, that silent connection, that breath between worlds. As if somewhere, just beyond the trees, something wild still watched. Sometimes, the most powerful connections in life don't come from words or logic. They come from presence. Elena and Mira's story reminds us that trust is built not through force, but through quiet consistency, empathy, and respect. Whether it's between humans or with the wild, healing happens when we choose to show up, again and again, without expectations, simply with an open heart. In a world that often demands noise and speed, there's something deeply human about slowing down and simply being with someone, or something that needs to be seen. So, maybe today the challenge isn't to do more, but to notice more. To look, really look at the world around you, at the people who are silently asking to be heard, at the creatures who live beside us, not beneath us. This story may have unfolded in the quiet of snow-covered forests, but the lesson carries everywhere. What we offer in gentleness may return to us in strength. Thank you for walking through this journey with us. If this story stirred something in you, we invite you to follow along with Paw Prints and Stories, where every tale leaves a mark on the heart.